Tulik. I'm the honor to chair the panel about Belt and Road Initiative and the EU-China relations. I would like to invite to the podium our speakers. We have today 4 speakers. Professor Wang Yiwei from the Zhemin University. Teresa Fallon, Director, Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. Professor François Godemont from the European Council on Foreign Relations. And Professor Dominik Mierzejewski from the University of Łódź. Once again, welcome all of you, our panelists, distinguished panelists from China and Europe, and all of you, and we would like to start the session about EU-China relations, but also under the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative. We have only 60 minutes for this session, so I would like to directly go to the questions and to the discussion, but let me at the beginning very briefly say that this panel is taking place in a specific momentum, I think. 3 points. First of all, we are in the midst of Donald Trump's visit to Asia. Today, US President finished his stay in China, and he went to China directly 1 year after being elected as a US President. We are also 3 weeks after the conclusion of the 19th Party Congress in China, which ended with a new lineup of leaders. We have new faces in the Politburo and the Standing Committee. We have a stronger Xi Jinping than in the first term. We have an announcement of a new era of his leadership. We have a new slogan, a new era of socialism with Chinese characteristics. We have this Belt and Road Initiative, which is the topic of our today's panel, written in the party chart or the party constitution. And the third point is that this year we had a EU-China summit, which the climate of this summit, which was held a month earlier than in last year. And despite the fact this climate of this summit was better than the previous year, the summit ended with no joint communique. So there is a kind of a signal that still these relations are not very, very good. And the EU is becoming tough on China with ongoing discourse of setting up investment screening mechanisms. So this is the background, and I would like to just to show you that it's a very important moment that we have this panel. And now I would like to very shortly introduce the structure of the panel. I would like to ask the 2 rounds of questions to our panelists, and then open the floor to you and encourage you to use this opportunity that we have in one place. So distinguished and very talkative speakers to ask questions. So if I may, I would like to first question direct to Professor Wang Yiwei. And maybe before, a short quotation from a paper which was published a year ago by Director Teresa Fallon. 2 sentences or 3 sentences about Belt and Road Initiative. Professor wrote that the New Silk Road is an extremely ambitious initiative that aims to reshape the current geopolitical landscape. But this initiative left many Europeans asking what it meant, what it was for, and what were the projects proposed. And the Chinese interlocutors could not answer it at first and were initially frustrated by the lack of enthusiasm shown by their European counterparts toward Silk Road. So now I would like to ask Professor Wang Yiwei the question, if you could explain very concisely, give us the definition of the Belt and Road Initiative, these particular objectives, economic and political drives behind this concept. So as a first part of the question. And the second, if I may, do you predict any changes or modification of the Belt and Road Initiative, bearing in mind the fact that this initiative is written in a CPC constitution and that it is a new era of Xi Jinping's term? Do you have any predictions if there is any chance that Chinese foreign policy will be changed generally and towards the EU? Professor?
Thank you, and very happy to attend the Warsaw Security Forum. Particularly, I attended many forums, but this is the only forum that covered the Belt and Road Initiative. 2 panels, and yesterday we also have another one, so very appreciative of that. Firstly, Belt and Road Initiative, we learned from Europe because the Silk Road put forward by German Hirschhofen, 1877. When he put forward this concept, it's more geopolitical consideration. So that reason you understand that the Belt and Road Initiative also from the geopolitics. That's very natural, but it's not, because it's the 21st century. It's not repeat the history. The Belt and Road Initiative is one concept to understand. It's mutual connectivity. In the world, they are not, even they call it global village, but it's not mutual connected. There are many connections through the US-led, technology, and it's not horizontal, mutual connected. Many countries still live in a very poor situation, marginalized. That's the reason the terrorism, the reason also anti-globalization movements. So the gap between rich and the poor is so huge, led by the new liberalism. It's the off capital, by capital, and for capital. But the Belt and Road Initiative focused on the infrastructure building, which will benefit for all, not just a benefit to the rich. I think they solved the problem of that. So that's the answer. And about the 19-party Congress, yes, the 19-party Congress written the Belt and Road Initiative in the party constitution. That means it's not short term. This is, we have 90 million members of the Communist Party. And then it's the strongest leader in China and also in the world. And so this is from long-term strategy that we have should, according to the Belt and Road Initiative, design in China's open reform, and also was written by the United Nations resolutions several times, including the Community of the Shared Future for the Humankind, the Belt and Road Initiative, and then joint consultation, co-responsibility and co-sharing principles, also written in the United Nations resolutions. So that's good. So we expect that the second term of the presidency will have more energy, focus on the Belt and Road Initiative, and also focus on the foreign policy. Because we have a strong, not just the presidency, but also Wang Hunin, so my teacher in the Fudan University, and also Yang Jiechi, promoted as maybe you say vice premier. So we have a strong diplomatic leader team, I think, also can have more energies. In the first term, more resources put on the anti-corruption, comprehensive reform, but now the world needs more public goods from China. So China is learning to do that. So we need to cooperate with the United States, with Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, very much for your intervention. So as I understand, so now the foreign policy is even more important than in the previous term of Xi Jinping, as you mentioned, the new people in this Politburo Standing Committee, Wang Hunin, Yang Jiechi, and this, as you said, that anti-corruption was the core of the first term. Now is probably foreign policy and this Belt and Road Initiative, which is long-term vision. So now I would like to ask Director Fallon, to be honest, the same question about this, your understanding of Belt and Road Initiative, these objectives, drivers, and if you predict any changes in China's foreign policy in pushing this Belt and Road Initiative implementation from the European perspective, from your perspective.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. I loved the video as well. It was very impressive, and I want to thank you for the hospitality I've been shown here. I grew up in a suburb of Chicago, and I was always told that the biggest population of Poles outside of Warsaw was in Chicago, so it's an honor to finally make it here. And Pulaski was a street that my grandma lived off of, so as a child I often rode on Pulaski, and now I'm here at the Pulaski Foundation, so it's really a joy and an honor to be here. In regard to your question about the Belt and Road Initiative, when this conference was organized, we didn't know Donald Trump would be in Asia at this time. So the timing is quite significant. The BARF, the Belt and Road Forum, which took place in Beijing in May, a very poorly organized acronym, I'm afraid, but this kind of marked a turning point in relations. Oh, first of all, I do want to preface my comments because I know Wang Yiwei for many years. I lived in China from 2003 to 2007. They were some of the happiest years of my life. So many people hear my voice. I have 2 passports. I'm Irish and I'm American, and they always want to put me in a box. I'm married to an Italian, and I've lived outside the US for about 30 years now. So I preface my remarks because sometimes people try to put them into a box. So that being said, going back to the BARF, it marked a watershed moment, I think, for EU-China relations, because there was many expectations. There's big numbers being bandied about. We even see with Trump's visit to Beijing, $250 billion of deals have been announced. But we know that from Eastern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe, many of these deals have been promised, but they've been phantom deals. They haven't really materialized. So there's kind of an expectation gap, or, you know, patience is wearing out. People are being promised many things, but it hasn't really materialized. So we see that this is something that happens not just in Central and Eastern Europe, but in China's dealings with other countries. So in Beijing, there was a very interesting moment where the EU member states were arriving to attend, and this could have been, the memorandum could have been circulated in advance to all the embassies, but instead they were just circulated at the very last minute. And there was pressure for all the EU member states who were attending to sign it. And Jyrki Katainen was also there, the Vice President of the European Commission, and he maintained discipline. So there was no Hungary breaking away or Greece breaking away. So it really was a significant change because in terms of economic issues, the EU still speaks with one voice, and no EU member state signed the memorandum. So I say that this is a significant change because it marked a watershed where it's not being embraced as strongly. The main issues at why the Europeans wouldn't sign it was because of issues in regard to transparency and environmental issues. And we've also seen the promise of investment, for example, in Piraeus, Greece, and the promised rail route. Well, that's being investigated now in Brussels by the Hungarians not having a tender to other countries. So the Chinese won the bid, but analysts have said that it would take 2,700 years to pay off the debt. So why would someone take that type of debt on when they could get EU member state funding for infrastructure? So we've seen this in other countries, for example, in Sri Lanka with the building of the port there. So others have called it debt trap diplomacy, and it's something every country should really be aware of and cautious. I don't want to take up too much more time. Any other question? Okay. Okay. And there's a cultural gap because the Chinese will say the Belt and Road is ambitious, but it's not clear. I'm sorry, I forgot the A2. So it's ambiguous and it's ambitious. So it's a top-down. When it was initially announced in China, over 1 million academic papers were written in the first year. So China has like a fever, and they can't believe that Europe is not, you know, embracing it. But the Europeans are a little more skeptical, and they ask, you know, what does it mean? What are the deals? What are the implications? Where's the money? And so it's 5 years now, and there has been very few deliverables. So I think that there has to be more on the Chinese side. And I suspect that now it's a strategic opportunity for China to put their investments more in their immediate Asian neighborhoods. We'll see. We've seen a lot more success in infrastructure projects there. Africa has grown a great deal from Chinese investments, and it's been a laboratory for Chinese going out strategy. So the lessons learned in Africa have actually been applied to Europe, but then there are some problems because EU rules are far more complicated, and this is maybe a problem for China, the Chinese companies to understand. In addition, since we are in Poland and you're a member of the 16+1, which is a sub-regional grouping organized by China that predates the Belt and Road Initiative. So there are 11 EU member states and 4 possible accession member states. And the Chinese narrative was, oh, we want to help the possible accession member states to become better EU members by our investments there. But the reality is we've seen, for example, Serbia, a few years ago, 89% of their rules and regulations were harmonized with the EU. Now it's declined to 69%, and that's largely due to Chinese investments. So instead of helping them become better EU member states, they're actually pulling them away from the EU. And there's a lot of skepticism in Brussels about the 16+1. And we've also seen, for example, with the arbitral tribunal decision last July. It was 3 years in the making. It was on the Philippines versus China 9-line issue. And it was held in The Hague, in Europe. No European member state sent an observer to watch this. When the statement was finally made, it took 3 days of negotiations among EU member states to come up with a very watered-down statement. They neither welcomed the arbitral tribunal decision nor supported it. They merely acknowledged it. So what does this mean? It means that Hungary and Greece blocked the statement. So in effect, China's been very clever and can actually buy a statement now. Thank you.
Thank you, Director, very much. You presented a very comprehensive picture of Chinese strategy, Chinese Belt Road Initiative, also this formula like 16+1. You mentioned some kind of debt trap diplomacy, or some ambiguous definition of the Belt Road Initiative and the 16+1. So I would like to ask Professor Francois Godemont also about the your professor definition or understanding of Belt Road Initiative. Also the 16+1, if still there is a kind of a, if this formula is still perceived as a kind of a threat or something like approach to divide EU, but also if the Belt Road Initiative is a Chinese grand strategy, and how you see how's your predictions after the CPC Congress, could this Chinese foreign policy also in the implementation of Belt Road Initiative could be changed a little bit?
Thank you very much, Justina, and thanks for the invitation. Teresa, God forbid that I be put into a box, or at least I'm not in a hurry. I'm going to try to give a serious answer to what's used to be called OBOR, One Belt, One Road. The Chinese now want us to call it the Belt and Road Initiative. We tend in Europe to call it the Silk Road. And of course, that's what has captured all imaginations. The Silk Road was invented by Europeans in the 19th century as a term. Unknown to most of us, I suppose, at this point, the EU had a Silk Road program going through Central Asia from the, shall we say, early to mid-90s. It still exists. In fact, it has got some very good features, but not enough money to go around with it. So by definition, we were the ideal public to welcome something called the Silk Road Initiative. On top of that, there are only maybe 50 million Central Asians. There are 500 million Europeans speaking broadly about EU and associated members. That is a huge market for China. China has repeatedly explained that this was the terminal point of the Silk Road, whatever it means. So, you know, what's wrong? Think Euro crisis, 2010, 2011, the bad days of speculating against the future of the Euro, and there it is. The Chinese Ministry of Finance announces that it's ready to join the so-called Juncker initiative for building up European infrastructures. That was before, by the way, OBOR was launched. So you have to see OBOR in a continuum that's, on the face of it, very positive. Think a little more strategically, geopolitics. We've been in a period when we're very much fear dependence on Russia, on energy, and occasionally on transportation routes. Well, the so-called connectivity scheme, the road, the railways, the maritime road, all of that represents a big alternative, especially for our Central and Eastern European members, to depending on Russia. Just as for energy, South Stream used to be the answer to Nord Stream. I'm tickled, by the way, even now, to find that the biggest project financed by the AIIB, this Chinese replica and complement to the World Bank, is actually focused on a pipeline from Azerbaijan to Europe through Turkey. That's quite, you know, the notion that the Chinese would finance energy flowing west instead of flowing east is something in a way that's interesting. The problem is, it an accident or is it a trend? And what has really happened? Well, I can only concur with Teresa on a number of features. During all this time, it's not that investment towards Europe has dried out. On the contrary, it has increased, but it happens, it goes most of all to mergers and acquisitions in Western Europe. Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, for complex reasons that also have to do with their membership in the EU, have not received much investment and have not been able or even willing to avail themselves of Chinese loans for large infrastructure projects. China itself, and that's something it has been doing also in Central Asia, and that's obviously something it's always done in Africa, tends to think bilaterally in terms of our relations with country X, our project, with country X, President X or Prime Minister Y from that country, and our relationship and what we do. That's not very transversal, that's not very integrative, and it's not that the Chinese could not evolve and could not change. For example, their OBOR project into Central Asia now have a component of stuff about logistics, cross-border transport, stuff that the EU, by the way, had thought of in the early 90s, which was the core of the EU project, was to break up the borders and barriers in the post-Soviet states to allow free flow of goods and people. Again, this is a sign I want to flag. Any Chinese project can change. But for the time being, this has not happened. There has been indeed a whiff of China. Is it too strong to say divide and rule in the EU, or taking advantage of possible cracks, you know, doing as Donald Trump just said in Beijing yesterday? It fascinated me. Can you reproach a country for taking advantage of another if that other country is not taking the measures it should take? I think it's more on these lines that we should think how the Chinese have acted, although it's been very systematic on the periphery of the EU. There is also an incipient 5+1 project with the Nordics, and there is clearly a very systematic Mediterranean push. But the fact is that it hasn't got huge results. The same, for example, $10 billion, by the way, because OBOR is always expressed in dollar, even when it's with European countries, never in euros. The same 10 or 11 billion dollars are repeatedly proffered every year, but they're not new dollars. They're the same dollars as the year before, which is an indication that things are not going fully ahead. The reality of it is that the Chinese have thought of this as a kind of grocery bag, a shopping bag. One could say almost a Spanish inn. You take from the Silk Road what you want to bring. And this means very different things to very different people. Take, for example, a very geopolitical topic. How much is this thought of in concert with Russia? How much does that actually sync with Russian initiatives? How much does it counter them or compete with them? You look at the gamut of countries from Baltic states to Poland to Bulgaria to all the way to Italy, this eastern and southern periphery, and you'll find that when the Chinese find the local ground is not particularly welcoming to Russian investors or Russian interests, the Chinese tend to act separately. When they feel there is a base, when they feel there is commonality possible, then they join. Or, in some cases, they replace the Russians after the Russians have been put under sanctions. But does this mean they are, standing in for the Russians? Or does it mean they are ripping off business from Russian firms? It's very difficult for me to answer in the long term. Somebody mentioned ambiguity, and I think ambiguity is a real characteristic of these Chinese initiatives. We should not, therefore, demonize them, but we should emphasize, I guess, to the Chinese that their vision of Europe is now slightly out of date. I'm being optimistic in saying that, but it's very clear when you read the experts and when you read the press in China. There have been examples again very recently, that it's still about fragmenting Europe, that it's still about populism, taking by storm one government against another. There is still this notion that Europe is unreal, and as a spokeswoman of the Foreign Affairs Ministry famously said 1 month ago, is a regional organization. Interesting, to define the EU as a regional organization. That's, of course, not a very high degree of recognition. The Chinese deny this, and in fact, they invest a lot of time, a lot of energy in diplomatic relations. The summits, there are 94 items on the China-EU 2020 agenda. Governments have a whole lot of visits on each side. There are even government-to-government, almost full-size meetings, for example, between the Germans and the Chinese. But compare it to the US. in theory, relations with the US under Donald Trump, given his campaign, his rhetorics, and some of his entourage, should be at the worst. Well, the Chinese pay extreme attention to the US. They exquisitely prepare what is being staged now in Beijing. Look at the EU in comparison. Yes, they come, but as they did, for example, this year in June for the last EU-China summit, at the last moment, they are likely to cancel one of the two communiques on climate, which was thought of by Europeans to be a kind of bridge between the Chinese and the Europeans, which they had prepared for months with actual projects. They can be very standoffish on investment negotiations. They can stonewall on trade when they don't like directions that the EU is taking in terms of anti-dumping, or today about market economy status. In otherwise, it's not that the Chinese don't deal with Europe, it's that they don't have an extraordinary amount of relations too, but they tend to limit it and to focus on the points that are of direct interest to them. And my gut feeling is that they still evaluate that they can pretty much sail their way through the rest. And, you know, just wait and see and hope for better times when the EU or a number of member states will fold and will accept other terms. That is, I think, a very important consideration, and I've tried to span the remarks on BRI, that's the official word, and an assessment of EU-China relations. Thank you, Justina.
Thank you, Professor, very much. So I would like to ask the question to Professor Dominique Mézières, because Professor Godemont mentioned that ambiguity is a real characteristic of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I would like to ask about your assessment, and also what this new term of Xi Jinping means, what may mean for CE countries, for Poland and for Łódź.
Thank you very much. I'm not from Warsaw. I'm working with Chinese local governments through my local governments in my local city, close to Warsaw. It's 1 hour by train. From capital of Poland to my city, we are working. We hope to have more Chinese investment. But let me offer you some my insights on the Belt and Road Initiative. The first important point here is that Belt and Road itself is an extension of China's domestic economic belt, of Yangtze River economic belt. Yangtze River economic belt is a belt from Shanghai through Wuhan to Chongqing and Chengdu, and then to the Euro-Asian continent. So definitely it's far bigger project that we are talking about. Europe, from this perspective, is a part of developing China's West, Central China and Shanghai together. So we need to acknowledge that from this perspective, the domestic perspective, this is just an extension of Yangtze River economic belt. And the Yangtze River economic belt was born in the mid-1980s, embodied by Hu Yaobang's government, then by Jiang Zemin, and finally embodied into the concept of Belt and Road. And this Belt and Road, it's a very peculiar story, I think, that was announced not in China. It was announced in Kazakhstan. And we are going from a domestic perspective to the, as was said by Francois, the geopolitical issue. That might brought us to the Mackinder concept of heartland. The Kazakhstan in China's foreign policy, I think, from this perspective at least, is placed as a very important pillar of developing China's going west strategy. That's the first point. And the Chinese narratives, it's very peculiar also that during the speech in Astana, 2013, Xi Jinping traced back to Western Han Dynasty. And Western Han Dynasty in Chinese history means a very centralized government. So that was the beginning, and from this perspective, also domestic affairs, the slogan served as a kind of leverage for building Xi's position inside party. And what we acknowledge after the 19th Congress, that this concept was embodied into the party constitution. But let us go back to this 2013. Why 2013? 2012, China failed with its policy towards Japan. Definitely, I think the Chinese decision-making realized that going east is not an easy issue. Quarreling with Japan over Diaoyu Senkaku, as we remember, September 2012, was not so easy. And the government then needed a success, simply. So that's why they changed totally the foreign policy orientations due to have simply a success. Japan is not an easy partner, we know it, but Kazakhstan, Central Asia, well, why not to try there? And that brought me to the one final point, and I will just go to European perspective, Central European perspective, what was said by Professor Wang, that's a benefit for all. That sounds like, you know, a kind of targeting a developing world. The Belt and Road is not about Western world itself, but it's rather about developing countries. And that's brought us to the very interesting perspective on Central Europe in China's foreign policy. Prior to the summit in Suzhou, 2015, there was a meeting in Beijing between Chairman Xi Jinping and all leaders from Central European countries. And while delivering his speech, Xi Jinping mentioned that the 16+ format, 16+1 format, is a very useful for strengthening relation between North and South, between developed world and developing world. But he also mentioned that this platform strengthens relations between South-South. So it sounds like Chinese diplomacy, to a certain extent, follows American narrative of Donald Trump. Donald Rumsfeld. New, old Europe. From Chinese perspective, the Central Europe belongs to the developing world. So that is really interesting when it comes to 16+1 platform. Western Europe is a different story. It's a well-shaped, developed world, while here, like Serbia, even Poland, we need all this infrastructure. So the China tried to treat us as a developing world. And this is a very peculiar story, and I would like to address this when it comes to my understanding of what's going on behind the curtain with Belt and Road. Well, maybe the final point here is that the Belt and Road Initiative itself has 5 connectiveness, as was said by Professor Wang. And one of this is people to people. This is translation from Chinese language, and I think it's not appropriate because Chinese call it minxin. Minxin means that we hope to build a positive feelings. So minxin should be later translated as China's soft power, has a good impact on public opinion towards all China's action taken in a global scene. So thank you, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Professor, very much for this very broad picture of your understanding of the Belt and Road Initiative, that to some extent it is an initiative directed to the global south, if I may put it in this way. And so, because from our European speakers, Professor, we heard some kinds of some skepticism, maybe some critical opinions. So I would like to ask you how is your response to this presented by Director Fala and Professor Godemont and Professor Mierzejewski about some kind of maybe challenges coming from the Belt and Road Initiative. So what's your response if these, fears, if I may put it in this way, are realistic? How to diffuse these concerns? And what China expects from Europe? And what is the way forward for the EU-China relations?
Thank you. I visited more than 45 countries in recent years to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, to communicate with the local people, local projects, and the governments, because I published 3 books on that topic. That's the reason I travel very frequently outside of Europe, not just in the US and Europe, which I previously focused. Let the local people to make the judge, not you say this good or not. For instance, when I visit Pakistan, Karachi, the big city, for a long, long time suffered of the shortage of the electricity. Every year, average 1,000 people will die because of without enough electricity. But now, by 2020, Pakistan will be energy independent country because huge investment of China. The Silk Road, the first project, is to help them energy independent. This is never achieved since independence, 1947. When I visited Nepal, many African countries, even the water, hot water cannot drink, no clean water. China is doing this, which the West cannot do. But you just blame that, you do that. I don't know, I don't understand why, you should ask those countries, those people make the judgment, not just you blame that and that, so-called debt. In Pakistan, from the failed state to the middle-income country, maybe in the 2030. So remarkable achievements of that. Second, you said that China divided rule of Europe. China is the most supportive of the European integration, even more than UK, as I always, said in Brussels, when I work in Brussels. China needs Europe to speak one voice. It's easygoing. You have the 28 embassies in Beijing, plus European delegation. If you just have one embassy in Beijing, it's easygoing. Why China make so huge deal with President Trump? Because President Trump is a one country president. European Union, you cannot be the one country. This is the reality. So we should deal with the different parts of the Europe in a different way. The gap between the rich and the poor, the east and the west, the south and the north, like Bulgaria. The per capita GDP is only $8,000 US. And Luxembourg, 10 times of Bulgaria. This is your reality. So 16+1, basically focus on those new members of the European Union, how to integrate with the European market, particularly for the Baltic countries, Balkan countries, right? Serbia and those. And again, you mentioned also about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the South-South cooperation. Actually, it's not the case. Most of the countries, there's 8 of them among the 6 economic corridors, 8 of them, the LDC country, like Nepal, Afghanistan. And the 24 countries, the human development index above the average of the human being. 16 of them, even not joined WTO. So this is the reality. We cannot apply the European high standard, transparency, IPR, rule of law to those countries. So China, we have the invisible hand, visible hand, work together to build the market for them. You cannot just rely on the market economy to finance the project infrastructure. So without infrastructure, like the Chinese people said, if we want to get rich, build the road. If you want to get rich quickly, build the motor road. If you want to get rich immediately, build the internet road. So that reason, China making remarkable achievements of the elimination of the poverty. If China can do, why not for those countries? So European side said transparency, the rule of law, of course this is very important, but step by step, we should create the conditions for those countries to adapt your standard. So we should work together as that. It's not just the developing countries, but also developing countries like Czech Republic. It's not a developing country, right? Hungary is also not a developing country. So it's a Belt and Road countries, developing countries, emerging market, and developing countries. So all this combined together, mutually connected, is very, very helpful for the world economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Because we have only 20 minutes to finish the session, I would like to first of all ask our European panelists the second round of questions following the last sentence that Professor Wang said that we should work together. And then after these questions to our European panelists, I would like to open the floor for the audience. So following this work together recommendation, I would like to try to turn our discussion to some positive aspects of EU-China relations. Because we mentioned some skepticism, some challenges in these relations under the Belt and Road Initiative, also because of EU-China ties. I think that there are also, especially now during the Donald Trump's administration, there are some prospects for closer cooperation between EU and China, such as to jointly defend some multilateral institutions and norms, to jointly facilitate globalization, defend Paris Agreement, fight to some extent with protectionism, maybe cooperate over North Korea problem. So I would like to ask all our European panelists how to make this cooperation more effective, if this kind of cooperation is possible, if EU could be an honest broker in the North Korean crisis, and how EU should pursue its policy towards China, also taking into account this China-US relations.
Okay, thank you, Justina. I think yesterday, when we were listening to Chopin, all these ideas were springing around in my mind, so it's always good to listen to Chopin. We don't make enough time to do that. EU-China relations, well, the key is to get EU-China relations right. We need to get EU-Asia relations right. And this idea of kind of a convenient marginalization from the area is a bit uncomfortable. For example, many EU member states have been selling weapons, not strategically, but they sell it to everyone who wants to buy it. There's an EU arms embargo. Wang Yiwei, you were infamous in Brussels for asking at every conference to lift it. This is still in place, but each EU member state interprets it according to their own national interests. So we see this huge dual-use goods being sold, which has helped China leapfrog their development of their military. So the EU says we don't do geopolitics, but at the same time they're selling weapons and dual-use technology to the region. And they feel that, you know, this arms race is kind of taking place because of the tensions in the region, but they kind of conveniently remove themselves and say, well, we don't do geopolitics, so it's not on our plate. So I think a little more thoughtfulness might be needed for that, and cooperation just for international peace. The EU is very interested in trying to create peace on the Korean Peninsula, but maybe they should look at Catalonia and you know, take care of things at home first. I think they lose a lot of credibility with things like that. The EU as an honest broker also is called into question when their values are eroded with weak statements on the arbitral tribunal, for example. How many European leaders will meet with the Dalai Lama? I can't think of any. So instead of Europe kind of influencing and changing China, I would argue that China has been changing Europe. And we should really be aware of that and what it's doing to the values within the EU. At the Munich Security Conference, for example, last year, Fu Ying spoke, and if you just look at her prepared remarks, you would miss the comments she made to the audience at the very, very beginning, saying, there's no such thing as universal values. They're just American values. And I see all of you nodding your head in agreement with me. So I found that really stunning to say that in Europe, which is the heart of the Enlightenment and the idea where the idea of universal values was born. So this is definitely a threat to China, this idea of universal values, and they're trying to divide the transatlantic alliance by emphasizing that they really don't exist and that they're just American values. And I think all of you who grew up in this region understand how important values are. Of course, all of us like investments and the promise of investments, but should, you know, be looked at with eyes wide open. Also, we see a change in Europe. There's been talk of a FDI screening. So the State of the Union address in September was, you know, guarded, and President Juncker announced that there would be a screening mechanism. It didn't say China, but most people understood it would be with China. So 2 years ago, China announced Made in China 2025, and we've seen a shift in investment patterns away from Central and Eastern Europe and more towards the developed economies because they're searching for the high technology. China wants to move up the value chain, and Germany has just been bombarded by all of these investments. For example, KUKA. It's not just a robotics company, it's the best robotics company in Europe, was sold to China by a company called Medea. Within 2 months, Medea had come up with a joint venture with the PLA. So German engineers are designing equipment for the PLA, so the People's Liberation Army of China. So I think Europe should really be a little more cautious and thoughtful in how they're doing these investments, and also for their long-term strategy. China They're very hardworking people, they're very smart people, and they want to move up that investment ladder. So they might be competing with these German investments or other investments throughout Europe. So we saw Germany, France, and Italy in February submit a letter, and also the European Parliament saying we need a screening mechanism for investments. And even here in Poland, the defense minister, Antoni, I'm going to do my best on this, Macierewicz, announced, sorry, I hope I didn't, mentioned that, you know, he tried to block the sale of a property in Łódź to a Polish-China joint venture. So even in Poland, there are some concerns about these types of investments. And finally, because Poland is on the road of OBOR, One Belt, One Road, sometimes people call it OBAO, One Belt, One Way. So we see a lot of trains coming through. The longest train route is from Yiwu, China, all the way to Madrid, Spain. And the vast majority of those cars are put back on ships because the Europeans don't have things to send back to China. So China is obviously subsidizing this railway. So what does this mean in the long term for your economies? Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. It was not pretty, very positive conclusion of the second round. So now I would like to pass the floor to Professor Godemont.
Thanks. Teresa's rather unilateral speech makes me want to agree with a few of Yue's points, just for the fun of it. First of all, it's really important that people like Yang Jiechi and Wang Huning are in charge in Beijing. I mean, Mao would turn in his grave if he knew that the former IR professor was a member of the standing committee and not a stupid one. Yang Jiechi has been renowned, is careful. So the last thing we should expect from Chinese foreign policy is idiocy. It's clearly smart, and even as the bureaucracy and the kind of mass movements propel ideas forward without thinking, I think that around Xi Jinping's personal power, there is now a top-down apparatus designed to control and to shape this into a more intelligent endeavor. I think that's important. Second, Yue is not wrong to say that there are huge disparities within the European Union. He cited Bulgaria. Indeed, Bulgaria has a per capita GDP that is now under China's. That's a fact. So we, Europeans and the EU, has to take into account different interests, different perspectives. I don't agree with the rest of his description, and being in Poland, by the way, I can still remember former FM Sikorski describing Poland as a member of the northern industrialized Europe and opposing it to the South, including to us Frenchmen, because we were so indebted at that moment. And I think there is a category mistake that China is doing there, which is to neglect the pull of the EU, the solidity of a number of links in spite of political trends. He is right that Central and Eastern Europe needs funds. Well, we've got structural funds. They dwarf anything that China has done by far. We wouldn't dwarf China in Pakistan, by the way. China is big in Pakistan thanks to cooperation with the Pakistani military. If the Karachi now has electricity all day, it's in part because of civilian nuclear plants deals done with China before OBOR, and that were controversial in the era when Pakistan was under sanctions because of its nuclear tests. So China can be big things in some places. Of course, OBOR is almost global. It's got 66 or 68, I'm never sure, target countries, and I suspect at the top they don't really count. We count, we try to keep track. They don't count, they just throw it ahead, and we have to pay attention to that. To come back to Teresa and to the EU problems, Teresa, note EU progress when it's being made. The discussion on market economy status and trade defense instruments went ahead when people expected it not to go ahead. The investment screening is not just an idea floating, it's an actual proposal that's come from the Commission to Parliament, has been going through Parliament, and is going to go through a difficult stage with the Council, certainly. the stuff about we export arms and dual-use stuff, well, come on. I mean, the US in the midst of a debate, for example, because China can buy as many startups as it likes, literally, in the US. Cyrus, an advanced aeronautics firm, has been okayed to be sold to China. We don't have a monopoly of this dual-use problem. It's a global issue, given China's current accent on tech policies, on acquiring military technologies for abroad. I fully agree on the scheme you painted for KUKA. It's repeated in other areas. China does two things. It invests, sometimes not even as a majority partner in a company, and then it lends, and then it propels that company, and that company can create subsidiaries that suddenly will have military ties, or the Chinese entity. There is clearly a scheme at work, yet it's certainly not reserved to Europe. In positive terms, what should we say to China? Because that was the question from Justina. First, please, in 2011, you mentioned your interest in the so-called Juncker Fund, which is now the ESI, the European Strategic Initiative, and which is key to integrating the continent and could in fact extend beyond EU borders. Well, where is the beef? Is it really a $250 million fund to buy stakes into small and medium enterprises that fills the bill? No. Accept, deal with EU rules, teach your companies to answer tenders instead of trying to go around them and dealing only with non-EU member states. Realize that your prognosis of the past 6 or 7 years that slowly but surely the EU is going down the drain, that's not working out. And so deal with us. On climate, because there are issues on which we could converge, especially given the current stand in the Trump administration. Well, don't hold climate hostage to a legal dispute on market economy status. Admit that it's an area in itself and that we could influence others together, and that we have finally resolved our quarrel, for example, on solar panels with China, compromised very clearly. Work on that. But the new thing is that China now tends to practice linkage, the thing that used to be ascribed to US strategy, and which could decide in one area for the sake of another. This is something that China is increasingly doing as it becomes more powerful, and this is dangerous for relations. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Professor Mierzejewski, could you limit your answer to 1 minute? Because we have to open the floor for questions.
Well, I think on the one hand, we are talking about the big issues, the global perspective, but on the other hand, from my at least perspective, the local cooperation is crucial. And partly that what was said by Wang, that people need, I mean, what I know in my city, we have a business people, they hope to export more their products to China, and we are working very hard with China's local government. And that's a part of the big picture. And what I realized, that I'm really thankful for the last report of Atlantic Council, who mentioned my city and Chengdu cooperation as a potential threat for Polish-American relations. So from this perspective, the local cooperation is growing, is booming, but we're gonna see the shadow of big powers politics, even in my city. And what I recognize, US follows China and China follows US. So from this perspective, we see that the whole global structure might be changing to triangular relations between China, Russia, and the United States. A final point to Dalai Lama, what was said by Teresa. I don't see Dalai Lama issue as a kind of value problem. It's a very practical method for gaining more from China. Czech Republic here is a very peculiar story. Very peculiar example. Once they have a good relations with China, with Dalai Lama, they met Dalai Lama in Prague. They had a very good trade relations with China. Now, these relations are not so, not booming at least. So definitely once they apply to all this Belt and Road policy, they have a very nice person as an advisor to President Zeman, and so on and so forth. Well, it's not so good, in a good shape. So maybe Dalai Lama can help us to have a better relations, at least in trade with China. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 10 minutes for questions. I would like to open the floor. Please introduce yourself and ask a very brief question to our panelists.
Hello, my name is Tatiana Agarkova. I'm from Ukraine, from Kiev, Hromadske television, Hromadske UA. My question goes to François Godemont. You were speaking about this One Road project as an alternative to infrastructure from Russia, and my question is about Ukraine. What benefits could Ukraine get from this project?
Okay, and we would like to collect one more. The lady in the first row.
Thank you. My name is Melissa Conley-Tyler from the Australian Institute of International Affairs, and I'd like to thank all of the panellists for today's discussion and also for a very interesting roundtable that we had yesterday. And one of the questions I was asked at the roundtable in thinking about China-EU relations is, do you have to choose between your relationship with the US and China? And Australia is a very instructive example that you don't need to choose. So Australia has a very strong security relationship with the US, a very strong economic relationship with China. On the security side, we're a treaty ally, we're part of the Five Eyes intelligence, we have 2% of GDP, etc., and we follow the US into every war, even the ones that the Canadians don't follow, we do. On the economic side, 25% of our trade is with China. And that's minerals, but that's also international education, tourism, and that's very comfortable for us as a very multi-ethnic nation with 20% of our population now Asian descent. So very quickly, I think it can be done. It's not easy. You tend to annoy both of them at various times. You know, you annoy the US when you go into the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. You annoy the Chinese when you say things about freedom of navigation. You've got to be very careful of Chinese influence on your own domestic governance and good governance, but you can do it. And my message would be that you want to develop your own relationship with China. China and the US have a very complex relationship of competition and cooperation and contestation. You can develop your own relationship and still be a very strong ally.
Oh, thank you very much. So now I would like to pass the floor to Professor Godemont. The first question was about Ukraine, and then to our panelists about the second question from our Australian guest. And I think that we should stop after these answers to the questions. Professor?
I'll give a broad answer. Two very bad things happened to the BRI scheme. One is the war in Syria and Iraq. If you look at all the roadmaps, it was supposed very naturally to go all the way to Latakia in Syria. Well, that's not going to happen anytime soon, I guess. And the other one is the Crimea-Donbass conflict, because that, for the Chinese, killed one of the rail areas. That's why they put so much accent on Belarus, and that's why there's a debate on Poland being ultimately the link between East and West, as you know, just the way station. So just in physical terms, of course, Ukraine and Hungary, by the way, lost from the conflict. If you look at the situation politically, it's very clear that China has been treading carefully on that conflict, avoiding to put its eggs entirely on one side, and refraining what I would call the worst. So it's probably very important for Ukraine to stay in touch with potential Chinese investors. I'm speaking very frankly and not as a European as a whole, but thinking of the obvious immediate interest of Ukraine. However, the moment when Ukraine, you know, in the past there have been deviations from Ukraine, and a lot of stuff that China has acquired in terms of modern weapons actually comes from former Soviet weaponries of factories that were in Ukraine. That was, shall we say, an opportunistic policy of Ukraine. That destroys the other side of the equation for Ukraine, which is sticking close to the EU and hopefully to NATO, even if it's not a member. So it's a balance. You're in a specific situation. You're not the only ones. Take a country like Estonia, for example. It's clearly being targeted by China as a kind of financial beachhead to Western Europe. Their union pay transactions will go through Estonia. The competitor to Uber in Europe will be an unknown Estonian company, really funded by the Chinese. But they're, as you know, they have a bigger neighbor and a bigger problem. And so we have to understand this particular balance. Just remember one thing, ultimately, China doesn't pick side, doesn't choose strategy, is not going to help you of its own will for geopolitical purpose. That's not the name of the game for China. It just seeks opportunities and, you know, tries to avoid bitter conflict, but to advance its interests.
Thank you very much. We have 4 minutes we have to finish in 4 minutes. So now I'd like to ask Professor Mierzejewski, then Director Fallon, and Professor Wang as a last speaker. Okay. 1 minute, please.
Yeah, thank you. One answer, 1 minute. Australia is a continent. In Central Europe, we have a totally different geopolitical position. And it might matter. I mean, in a sense that we are between Russia, Germany, and so on and so forth, and China is here. So it's not so easy as might be in Australia, for example. You are far away from all this geopolitical issue. We are far away from heartland. Sorry to say, but that's reality. Well, that's my answer.
Director Fallon.
Just to pick up on the Ukraine question, it was the end of the Belt and Road initially planned, and what happened in Crimea changed all of that. So China had big plans for Ukraine, and it seems to have, all right, there's I have 1 minute. So in a nutshell, Sino-Russian tensions, what are they? Frenemies, friends with benefits? How will this play out? We see various rail gauges along the way, a lot of security issues. So just to this whole railway, I'm dubious about, especially with historically low shipping rates. For the last 6 years, they're almost going bankrupt, these companies. So it doesn't make economic sense to me. So I'm wondering, what are they doing? What's behind it? I don't have the answer, but I think we should all think about it very carefully. And I want to end on a positive note, but I think we really have to have our eyes open. China has stated, they have these 2 anniversaries coming up. And what's happened in Hong Kong? I mean, they've just kind of ripped up that agreement and are kidnapping citizens while they're on vacation in Thailand, for example. We have to really, pay attention. It's all nice to have, rainbows and unicorns, but I think we really need to open our eyes and see what's happening. The tensions in the region are growing. I was just in Japan, and the Japanese are extremely concerned. North Korea, China says we have absolutely nothing to do with it, but there's plenty of evidence that they've been helping with the nuclear program. So I think we really need to have, clear vision and a strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Wang asked me to give him a floor to conclude the session. So, Professor, have a minute.
Thank you. Because I worked in Brussels 3 years in Chinese mission to the European Union. So I met Fallon and Franz Gudemont very frequently. And first about Madame Fallon, I think she just mentioned everything he said before yesterday. He just repeated the cliché. I responded in a very positive way, but he didn't answer, listen, just like one way. Actually, because of sanctions to Russia, so our goods cannot pass through Russia territory and reach China. If no sanctions, this is definitely very helpful. So it's not China substitute without that, and cover the common universal values. I attended the same forum with Madame Fu Yin, the military secretary contact. He said that is China, because we're a circular society, we don't think this the universal values, it's the common values of humankind. And Europe and the United States, of course, share many values. We are not challenged with that. But China and the European also share many values, like the multilateralism, multipolar world, and global governance. That's very normal. So you should seek the truth from the facts. The truth is not like what you said, and about many things about for the Philippines, the Suez case in the South China Sea. It's not a nine Dutch lines. It's about the territory between China and the Philippines per se. China respects the international law because international law also authorizes the government not to shoot this case. It's also the way to recognize and respect the international law. So many things. I don't have time to, and then Franz Gudemont, he's always smart, too smart. China, you have bad intention, evil intention. When I work in Brussels, I wrote down what he said to report to the Chinese government. Even we don't think about that. So he reminded China should do that. So we learn from you about so many, strategy. And we don't have so many strategy. We just do. We just work. We work very hard. So we are learning. Okay. Thank you.